Hello, I'm Fergus Hanson, Director of the International Cyber Policy Centre at ASPI. We're absolutely delighted to have two of Australia's foremost cybersecurity leaders with us today, the head of the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, Abigail Bradshaw, and the Deputy Secretary for Policy at the Department of Home Affairs, Marc Ablong. Abby and Marc, thank you so much for taking the time to participate in this ASPI event. Cybersecurity discussions move fast, but even by that standard, the recent pace of change seems exceptional. In the midst of a global pandemic and a major economic crisis, you've both overseen the launch of a new national cybersecurity strategy with an increase in financial commitments too. To me, that signals pretty clearly that we've reached a point where the challenges posed by cybersecurity are now so significant we can't afford to delay, even in the face of a much bigger immediate crisis. Since the strategy's released, we've had the launch of the IoT Code of Practice, the Critical Infrastructure Discussion Paper, and today the Critical Infrastructure Supply Chain Discussion Paper. Abroad, the US Department of Justice continues to indict state-sponsored foreign hackers. We've seen major ransomware attacks around the world and warnings from the US Treasury not to pay them. The Cyberspace Solarium Commission white paper on secure supply chains was released, mentioning China over 100 times and Russia once. There has been the partial sale of TikTok, allegations of interference in the US presidential election, and the New Zealand Stock Exchange incident. With those wide-ranging developments as background, we're really delighted to have Abby and Marc here to share their insights on Australia's cybersecurity policy and the operationalisation of that strategy. The format for this afternoon will be opening remarks from each of our two speakers, followed by some questions from me, and then moderated Q&A. I'd invite you now to please, as we're going through this session, send through your questions in the in the right-hand panel, and I'll do my best to get through as many of them as we can with our speakers. And I'm also taking them via Twitter. With that, I'll pass the floor to Marc for his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Fergus, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. Cybersecurity doesn't exist in a vacuum. We don't do cybersecurity just to do cybersecurity. It's about a more fundamental challenge that we, all of us have in the 21st century, which is we're moving into a digital economy globally, and the technologies that underpin that digital economy, because they're being created at pace and oftentimes in very many ways for very many reasons, whether they be the autonomy of things like self-driving cars, whether that be contactless retail, whether that be the way in which we engage with our governments, is increasingly done in the digital world. The government recognised that. In fact, you might recall that the Prime Minister made a rather major presentation at the end of last month on Australia as a digital economy, and the government's desire to very much ensure that Australia can be a leading digital economy by 2030. The digital business plan that he announced had 5 pillars: modern new infrastructure and skills, fit for purpose regulatory settings, small and medium enterprise support and capability, digital government that's easier to deal with, and trust and security. And ultimately, with the release of the cybersecurity strategy, the government set the foundations for all of those pillars through the work that we are currently doing in recognising the interdependencies of much of the critical infrastructure that drives our economy. As we've seen during COVID, panic buying on the shelves requires you to think not just about the food and groceries industry, but the freight and transportation industry. It requires you to think very, very broadly. Can you imagine what might have happened if the electricity grid had gone down during that same period, or the telecommunications infrastructure had gone down? How would we as a nation, as an economy, have survived not just the blow of COVID, but a major outage of our telecommunications or energy infrastructure? So fundamentally, the cybersecurity strategy recognises that we need to build trust and security into Australia's digital economy. and it sets the boundaries for the way in which the government will proceed. It will do a lot more to protect critical infrastructure, where it, as the regulator of critical infrastructure, can make a major difference in ensuring that infrastructure owners take responsibility for their security, are obliged to report on that security, and where they are designated as a system of national significance. In other words, something so critical to the nation's ongoing economic and social life that they very much deal with the cybersecurity challenges. The strategy also talks in large measure about the need to have business-to-business and business-to-consumer arrangements that protect financial dealings, that protect personally identifiable data that consumers give to businesses. And it talks about establishing better regulation to ensure that companies understand what their obligations are, both from the Privacy Act perspective, but also from the cyber perspective. And finally, it recognises that consumers need to be better educated, to be provided with better awareness of the cyber challenge they face in engaging in the online world. What information are you giving to a company or to an application that you have on your phone, and how does that expose you and make you vulnerable in the online environment? And so the cybersecurity strategy really tries to deal with all three of those elements. What does government need to do in terms of critical infrastructure? What do companies need to do? And what do consumers need to do? I might stop there and turn over to Abby.
Thanks, Mark. So I'm going to approach my remarks from a wholly operational perspective. I run the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. We operationalise the strategy that Mark's just talked about. The way I want to frame this is it's very easy to say, and we have done so in our inaugural AFP, ACIC, ACSC threat report. And the underlining headline is that the number of cyber attacks has increased in sophistication, scale and frequency. It's easy to say, but I just want to spend a moment talking about the cost of that statement, because I think it's critical to understanding awareness and then to understanding why we're taking the approach that we are. It's the business case, if you like, which supports the strategy and the policy framework. Firstly, I think people start from a premise that cyber and cybersecurity is important because it's a cost in terms of revenue terms, a cost because a business stops operating, or because they lose revenue because of a disruption, or because they've lost money as a consequence of theft or fraud. But in fact, whilst we've observed plenty of that in the last 6 months, there are a variety of other costs which we've observed as a consequence of malicious cyber activity. Those include the loss of privacy from intrusion and the loss of data, the loss of intellectual property, the loss of research and development information, the loss of potential future earnings and marketplace, the degradation of our confidence in democratic institutions as a consequence of the potential for interference in political organisations or even elections, the loss of access to essential services and amenities, the loss of economic wealth as a consequence of criminal cyber targeting we've seen on the COVID welfare and stimulus packages, the loss of confidence to engage in digital life and commerce, and most recently reports out of Dusseldorf, Germany, which indicate the loss of life as a consequence of attacks on critical systems. So I just want to frame it like that in the context of why do we care so much about cyber and why is it so important to have a strategy and to operationalise that? It's because that threat affects our national prosperity, our democracy, our way of life, and in fact, as we've seen recently, life itself in some instances. And that cost, both financial and existential, is by virtue of our dependence on global connectivity, only likely to increase, particularly as we live life and we prosper by virtue of that connectivity, and COVID has demonstrated that to us in real terms over the last 6 months. That's why, as the head of the ACSC, it's delightful for me to have a strategy, because when you've got a problem of that enormity and of that weight, you've got to start with a strategy and an investment in capability, which we've most recently had a $1.35 billion investment in what we call CSER, the Cyber Enhanced Situational Awareness and Response Program, which clearly I'll be delighted to speak about today, Fergus. But just to underpin the sort of philosophy that goes along with that strategy, given the enormity of the problem that I've just set out, each one of our operational approaches and those investments goes to achieving always defence is the best offence, and wherever possible, operational responses which achieve scale, speed, and wherever possible, automatic.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for those introductory remarks, and thank you all our participants for all the questions that are flying in. There's lots of really good ones there, and I will be getting to them shortly. Maybe just to kick off though, one of the big pieces of work underway at the moment is obviously the consultations and the I guess the legislation regulation that will implement the critical infrastructure piece, critical national infrastructure. But I was interested in if you could talk a little bit about that. We've seen the inclusion, as you mentioned, of lots of things that haven't traditionally been thought of as critical infrastructure: data and the cloud, education, research and innovation, food and groceries, health and transport. And you mentioned the incident in Germany recently, Abby. Marc, I was wondering if you could lay out the rationale and thinking behind the discussion paper. How long has this been in the works? Why now rather than, we've had lots of discussions on critical infrastructure for a while around the vulnerabilities, and we've seen examples, for example, in the last US presidential election around some of the potential vulnerabilities of voting systems and attacks and power grids in Ukraine and other Saudi Aramco incidents. What's sort of the rationale and the impetus behind this initiative?
Thanks, Fergus. And it's a good question. We've had a Security of Critical Infrastructure Act since 2018 that against a limited sector of critical infrastructure is principally about ports and harbours, airports, the telecommunications and energy sector. They were the major critical infrastructure sectors that we dealt with. And principally the Act, while it asked people to take an all hazards approach to understanding how they needed to protect themselves from security challenges, in the main dealt with those sorts of physical challenges to critical infrastructure, and the way in which you had to have the right sort of fence, a business continuity plan for when the fire came through and took out your generators, those sorts of things, in order to assure the safe and effective operation of critical infrastructure during periods of crisis. As a part of doing the cybersecurity strategy work, which we had been doing for at least a couple of years before the release of the cybersecurity strategy, we recognised that cyber created new challenges for critical infrastructure in particular. Increasingly, we are seeing IoT being one of the major enablers of critical infrastructure in what they call OT, operational technologies. We're seeing mines being run by remote control from headquarters with, autonomous mining vehicles actually digging out the product and loading it onto autonomously driven trucks and moving that to a port. And there are very few people around as part of that process. Dams are run remotely from headquarters. We are increasingly seeing cyber becoming one of the critical vectors by which challenges to the security of critical infrastructure could occur. So it made sense for us to bring the protection of critical infrastructure and the new classification, which we call systems of national significance, those particular parts of critical infrastructure that are so critical to the fundamental operations of the economy or society that they needed additional protections, it made sense for us to look at a legislative framework that replaced the old SOCI Act, as we call it, the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act, with a new variant that allowed us to take a more expansive view of the threats to critical infrastructure and how we deal with them. So as you said, we've been consulting with industry, critical infrastructure owners and the community since the release of the cybersecurity strategy. That consultation process has now come to an end, and we're in the process of drafting the legislation for the amendment of the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act. It broadens the scope, as I said, of critical infrastructure sectors. It establishes a positive security obligation on entities in those sectors, and we're designated as a system of national significance. It puts an obligation on them around cyber that doesn't or hasn't existed in the past. So it was time. It helps us to ensure that at its heart, we can ensure the effective functioning of the Australian society. And before somebody asks a particular question about sectors versus systems of national significance, if I can give you an example, while the banking sector is considered to be critical infrastructure, not every bank is considered to be a system of national significance. The system of national significance in the banking sector is something like the SWIFT payment system. So the process that allows you to go into a store, use an EFTPOS machine to pay for your goods, and for the banks to reconcile the transaction between your bank and the bank that the vendor has as their bank. That is quite critical to the effective functioning of the economy. We've seen cases where the EFTPOS system has gone down and people have been required. In fact, it happened to a particular grocer not more than a couple of weeks ago, where suddenly they had to ask people to leave the store and leave their groceries, a major chain, those sorts of things when they happen. And that wasn't because of a cyber attack, it was just a failure of their IT system. But you can see the impact of those things, and we need to work to fix that. So that's why we're doing the critical infrastructure work.
Thank you. And Abby, am I right that the ACSC will be requesting real-time data from critical infrastructure operators? And would you be able to talk a little bit about what the ACSC will be using that data for and how it will be used to defend critical infrastructure? And is it about helping government to have a better bird's eye view of what's going on at a national level?
Sure. So the starting point, I think, Fergus, is just to get it out of the way, that ACSC does not conduct mass surveillance of the domestic use of the internet. So largely, in order to draw a national picture of threat, we're reliant on information that people share with us about vulnerabilities, about compromises, and obviously, there's a lot of information which we share through global partners, which is very useful as well, because cyber is a global threat. What's a threat overnight in the States could well be a threat in Australia by morning. So I'd start by saying there's a bunch of information which is really useful to us in order to be able to build that situational picture, which is a major core of or focus for us in our CSER program, because when we have a comprehensive national picture, we can use our nodes, our partnership programs, our reach out to both industry and all Australians, right down to the individual, to pass that information as quickly as possible to enable people to lift defences. So that's the ultimate or foundational operating model. The sort of information which is interesting to us are indicators of compromise. It's suspicious activity or vulnerabilities. Those can come in many forms: logs, disk images, images of servers, depending on how a network is set up. sometimes access to near real-time telemetry is useful. Let's just put that in context. The information which we're interested in is cyber security telemetry. It's network traffic. It's not individual transactions. We're interested in ones and zeros and binaries and strings that our best technically qualified people, some in the world, but certainly in Australia here, are able to analyse for indicators of compromise. And as I said, the purpose of that is to develop a national picture which we're able to share with all Australians at speed and at scale. A fundamental element of the CSA package is enhancements to our existing threat sharing platform. So under the 2016 strategy, there was an investment in the generation of a threat sharing platform which enables us to share indicators of compromise in machine readable form. That, of course, speeds up the capacity that we're able to push information out, and it's able to be received in order to be analysed by individuals, not by us, which is actually our preferred method of operating. The investment under CSA will enable us to evolve that platform to the next level, where we're actually able to share information in near real time bidirectionally. That is, not only do we push information out, but we're able to pull information back in as well. So all of that is designed around building that common operating picture for the purpose of sharing and raising defences, defending and mitigating. All that information is only ever utilised consistent with the legal framework for the purpose of our protect and assist function.
Great, thank you for that. I wanted to turn now to one of the questions around that must be cause a lot of pain for you as in your roles, and that's the issue of government departments uplifting themselves. The strategy talks about government leading by example in cybersecurity, and that it will strengthen the defences of its networks by centralising their management and operation, including considering secure hubs. And we at the Cyber Centre have been, working with government on some of the thinking around this. But I was interested, Marc, in firstly with cybersecurity is all about priorities and making choices. Given that there is an additional funding to uplift government agencies, is the strategy about asking departments and agencies to push cybersecurity a bit higher up their priority stack and therefore forego something else? And what is it that they should be doing? They should not be doing to get cybersecurity. I presume you're going to say that will be a decision for them, but I'd be curious on your reactions to that.
Thanks, Fergus. So the government, as an exemplar part of the cybersecurity strategy, does talk about our need as a government to start to centralise some of those major platforms that the government runs. There are more than 196 Commonwealth government departments and agencies, and you can imagine each one of them having a need for a CIO and a CISO and a cybersecurity apparatus could be and is quite expensive for government. So the idea of centralising is to say that it is not essentially necessary that each agency in and of its own right is a fully capable cybersecurity operations centre with the appropriate protections, because if you were doing that 196 times, you'd run out of money before you run out of targets in the government sector. The challenge is to say, how can we as a government best deliver both services to Australian citizens, but also services to industry and to other government agencies, both at the Commonwealth level and the state and territory level, in a more centralised way that effectively allows us to all shield under larger umbrellas than each of us having our own individual cocktail umbrella. So the way forward is not about asking agencies to prioritise cybersecurity over other things. It's about effectively saying, how do we ensure that those big portfolios of state that have responsibility for major IT are providing services to their colleagues within their portfolio or in related agencies where they're delivering similar services. So, anything which is related to, for instance, the payment of entitlements to Australian citizens, you might put under one umbrella rather than having lots of little umbrellas. Anything that's related to the way in which both companies, individuals pay government for the services, taxation, for instance, you might put under a big umbrella so that you can provide better protections for the mega systems rather than each individual system.
Thanks, Marc. And Abby, I guess the flip side of that is how can the ACSC help departments? And in your view, do they need to start making some difficult choices to get this done?
Well, I'd start by saying we do help the departments every day. They are clearly, in the context of the current threat environment, prime targets. And so we work very closely with departments every day. We recently concluded a government uplift program to uplift the cybersecurity of sprints through a variety of sprints with 25 agencies. We have a cybersecurity fund which we've utilised and directed at agencies who we felt could utilise some additional assistance to uptick their cybersecurity. We've recently, we have had for some time actually it's a forum in order to, in a more regular, focused and direct way, share our advice about the threat environment and practical ways of actually addressing those. And I think actually our recent experience this year, particularly through the experience of the ongoing targeting by a sophisticated state-based actor, indicates some pretty good progress in the response of agencies, the speed of response in general cyber hygiene practices like logging, and certainly their capacity to block and respond and mitigate. Our experience through incident response this year is that there has been some improvement in the cyber hygiene practices of government departments. We fully support the hubs model, that concept of broadening the umbrella, as Marc eloquently puts it, or sharing the expertise, the visibility, importantly, because all roads lead to having that common operating picture, and the expertise of those agencies to know what bad looks like and to know how to block it and to do will be another, I think, step forward. We, for the first time this year, tabled in the Parliament the first report on cyber resilience and adherence to the essential 8 of government departments. That sets out, perhaps in a more detailed way than I have now, the sorts of areas where we've seen advancement. But there is no question, particularly given not only the speed at which cyber vulnerabilities emerge, but the reality is that a number of these organisations run enormous service delivery platforms, and many of them have legacy systems that we need to take a practical rather than strict compliance approach to managing risk, and that is the way that the PGPA is set up, such that the agency head makes the decision on how to balance and mitigate those risks.
Thank you. You both talked about the cybersecurity being a shared responsibility, the need to get businesses and individuals involved in this as well. And the strategy foreshadows there's a quote, possible legislative changes that clarify the obligations for businesses. Abby, I was wondering if I could ask you that ASD it's received a lot of kudos for the top 4 mitigation strategies that evolved into the Essential 8. But we've seen repeatedly through ANAO audits, I know there's some issues, people have questions around that and how that's done, but it seems it's very difficult for government to strictly comply. Most government departments find it difficult to strictly comply with those Essential 8 measures. What are we looking at for businesses? Is it going to be the same framework, or it will be a different framework or security standard that will be sensible for businesses? And will it be sort of a difference will there be differences for SMEs versus very large corporations?
Well, to start with, of course, the ACSC is not a regulatory agency, nor does it seek to be. There are great benefits in this agency retaining its capability to provide a protect and assist function that benefits us in terms of access to information and people's willingness to share that information with us, and we would not seek to change that. We promote the Essential 8 and the associated maturity model as a model which is great for government but equally great for business. I think there is utility in simplifying to the extent possible those sorts of frameworks, in fact, any sort of framework for obligations. I think that model, whilst we're constantly reviewing it with both industry engagement and with other departmental or whole of government colleagues, the maturity model's pretty good. I think it acknowledges that agencies need their own flexibility in order to make decisions about which areas they will focus on and at what pace, at the same time giving them visibility of the areas in which need to improve, but also giving capacity for practical decisions to be made around workarounds based on the network owner's own assessment and understanding of risk, which will often be the greatest. I think what Marc and I are working really closely on is ensuring that any new obligations are completely complementary, that where possible we reduce wherever possible, I should say, reduce any sort of duplication. And, I'm reading as we go on the questions coming up on the side and the theme around better coordination. Marc and I and other departmental colleagues as individuals who, in our own personal right, take a service from government in terms of cybersecurity are constantly and consciously aware of the need to streamline the voices and the rules.
Great. And as you noticed, no doubt, there's quite a few businesses that are participating in this event. Marc, are you able to talk a little bit about the sort of clarity that we're talking about when the strategy says possible legislative changes that clarify the obligations for businesses? We've seen, well, at least some of the feedback we've seen is some of the things that have really focused minds is, the huge fines that have been levied against businesses overseas for poor cybersecurity practices. Is that type of approach on the cards here, or what type of measures did you have in mind?
Yeah, thank you, Fergus. And to assure those who are watching, we're not intending to create a massive regulatory burden on individuals to be, living under the highest level of standard for cybersecurity. Not all businesses can bear that cost, nor particularly should they. If you're the local florist, you have a different cyber risk appetite than a major bank. And so it's important that the regulatory burden, should there be one, fall on those best able to bear it, rather than applying a one-size-fits-all approach to cybersecurity to everybody. That being said, there are already many regulations, laws that exist that require people to both protect the data of their customers under the Privacy Act. If you're a financial institution, you're already required under the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority's rules to take all reasonable steps to protect your financial institution from cyber threats. Under the accounting and auditing standards, companies are required to report on any material or manifest issues that will affect their ability to deliver revenue and will affect their profit and loss. So all of these things currently exist. What we are looking to do is to ensure that people understand that cyber is a fundamental part of those risks in today's reality. As I mentioned in the start, we're moving to a fully digital economy. Over the period of COVID, we've seen a dramatic uplift in both businesses going online as well as consumers going online. And so what we're trying to achieve in terms of suggesting to companies that there is a need for them to think seriously about cybersecurity is to ensure that they are following the rules, the regulations, the laws that currently exist with respect to cyber. Now, does that mean that we are considering things like, for instance, being very specific about the duties that directors owe to both their shareholders as well as their consumers of the cyber risks? We may go there, but we are not intending to legislate broad cyber standard requirements anytime soon. The cybersecurity strategy talks about us setting up a best practice regulation task force and allowing us to co-design with industry over the next 12 to 18 months sensible regulatory frameworks. So if I can give you an example of what we're thinking, if you are a small to medium enterprise that by dint of the nature of your company, whether it being incorporated or not, producing products and services, but you're just living on the edge in terms of your resources, you know that any regulation that specifically asks you to do cyber might be more than your company can bear. So we've talked a bit about bundled services. All companies, whether incorporated or not, if they're engaging with money, have a bank account. They probably have a relationship with a telco that provides them with at least a telephone number, if not an internet connection. Both of those particular sectors, the banking sector as well as the telecommunications sector, have very, very good cybersecurity practices. So there's an opportunity for banks and for telco companies to provide as a service to small to medium enterprises a secure environment in which to conduct their businesses. That links their banking details with their inventory management system, whatever that might be. Assuming it's not a shoebox in the corner with your receipts in it. There is opportunity here for telecommunications company, banks, accounting companies, auditing companies that actually have an ability to service and currently do service many hundreds, if not thousands of businesses to provide a service to those small to medium enterprises that is the cybersecurity service. So these are the opportunities we want to take advantage of before we go down the line of legislating or regulating that everybody needs to hit the NIST standards or whatever it might happen to be.
Great, thank you very much, Marc and Abby. I'm now going to turn to the many questions that have come in, and seeing as we're living in a democracy and we have to choose between many, many questions, I thought I'd go with the most upvoted questions first, if that's okay with you. Trevor Chudley has said, Australia has 5 federal government ministers, each of whom has some element of cybersecurity as part of their portfolio. Does the lack of a single responsible minister impede the development and execution of a coherent national cyber strategy? I look forward very much to your comments on this.
There's a short answer and there's a longer answer. The short answer is no. And why? Because cyber is now part of almost everything that we do. My boss, Secretary Pizzolo, likes to use the analogy that we don't have a minister for the air. Yet there are air standards for pollution, there is air traffic management, there is an air force. There are many parts of the Australian government that is engaged in cyber, because cyber is part of many of the activities in which Australian citizens, Australian consumers, Australian businesses and government engage in cyber matters. But, you know, the cybersecurity strategy isn't a Home Affairs cybersecurity strategy. It's a national cybersecurity strategy signed off by the Australian government and covering all of the aspects. Minister Andrews has come out with some further particulars about cybersecurity as it affects industry and the sorts of programs that they might put in place to support Australian industry to uplift cybersecurity. Minister Tian's come out with the same thing for the education sector and talked about how they will assist, or the government will assist, Australian universities to think about cybersecurity and the protection that they need to put in place. The Small Business Minister has done the same thing. The Minister of Education is looking at educational standards and whether we need to have more micro-credentialing around cybersecurity courseware. So, of course, you would expect there are many ministers involved in thinking about cyber, whether it be the Communications Minister, who has online safety, which is very much about the content of the digital world, the Minister for Home Affairs, who's responsible for thinking about cybersecurity as a national security challenge, the Defence Minister, who thinks about it from the perspective of the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. That's only appropriate. If they were all in one organisation, all under one minister, you can well imagine a circumstance where you would then get a very disconnected government when it comes to its cyber activities.
Abby, did you want to add anything there, or happy to move on?
Yeah, I think, well, on one level, you might consider it as a feature of maturity and potentially an acknowledgement of a level of awareness and normalisation of and acceptance of cyber risk. We want to, from an operational perspective, the best outcome I could have is that cybersecurity is at the forefront of everyone's minds as they go about their days, whether that's in the health sector, in the education sector, in the manufacturing sector, or in defence. It's the sign of a healthy ecosystem, I think, if it's part of everyone's responsibility. That's not to say that there aren't times when you need a particular focus or a particular advocacy, that point of reference is not useful. But I think in some instances you might regard it as a sign of maturity.
Great. We have Stacey Watson, who has a very popular question and one that we've been very interested in at the Cyber Centre as well. How does the Australian government plan to hold states accountable when it comes to state cyber interference, as these events are evidently becoming increasingly frequent?
I'm assuming you're talking about international states rather than the states and territories of the Australian Federation, because that's a way more difficult question.
Yeah, I interpret it as foreign states. I mean, we had the announcement the other day from a little while ago, of the Prime Minister talking about a sophisticated state actor. We've had, the WannaCry and NotPetya attacks that we've attributed, but are we at the point yet where we're able to attribute more of these attacks? And I suppose the big question, get to the point where we're able to start imposing costs on states that are willing to take these sorts of measures?
There's two parts to that answer, and a third that I'm sure Abby will give. The first thing is that we have a cyber ambassador, Toby Feakin, whose job it is to assist Australian national policy to advocate in the international environment about norms and standards in the international environment about what is good in cyber and what is not. And Toby does a power of work in the United Nations systems and elsewhere, working very closely with us around things like cybercrime and what should be the international collaboration and standards around dealing with the issues of cybercrime, as well as the big United Nations frameworks. it's important that we start to develop some norms in the international environment that have some stickability as opposed to being shelfware. So firstly, that is a fundamental part of our ability to hold people to account, is to hold them to account for what, and those international norms and standards are very, very important. The second thing is that, fundamentally, it makes no sense to hold people to account for things if you cannot demonstrate in an appropriate forum the attribution of that to a particular individual. Obviously at a political level, there are often occasions where people will name a particular country actor or a particular non-state actor for political effect. That's one thing. But if all you're going to do is the hat tip or the shout out, that's not necessarily the same as holding somebody to account. And we collectively in the international environment haven't yet got to the point where we are seriously holding people to account for anything. So fundamentally what we've been focused very much on is how do we make ourselves more resilient to cyber attacks? How do we become a harder target? Because that's the first thing you do. Rather than, if I use an analogy, not perfect, but an analogy, if you live in a high crime area, the thing you don't do is put up the posters of all the criminals first. The first thing you do is secure your house and make sure that your property is protected, and that is a fundamental duty of the Australian government with respect to the Australian nation. If you then are able to identify the particular criminal who has stolen your property or damaged your property, then you take it to an appropriate law enforcement process. Now, what is that appropriate law enforcement process in the international environment?
So
do you want to jump in on this, Abby?
Yeah, I'm not going to answer that question, but I am going to respond from an operational perspective. And firstly, our starting point is that attribution. If that's what the reference is to, it could be that in terms of holding states accountable is only done in circumstances from a policy position in Australia where it's in the national interest to do so. And part of that calculation is only in circumstances where we have the utmost technical confidence of properly attributing, because, of course, the negative impacts of not being so would be grave indeed. From an operational perspective, I can tell you that our assessment actually of attribution is it makes very little difference to an actor's behaviour. What I can tell you practically about the Prime Minister's and the Minister's statement on the 19th of June from my lived experience is that on the 19th of June, the Prime Minister and Minister made a statement to the Australian public largely about lifting our national defences against what was described as a new normal, or what I described at the outset of this session to be increased sophistication, volume and scale of that sort of malicious activity. We gave three messages. One was to patch your systems. One was to use multi-factor authentication, and the third was to become an ACSC partner. And that's because if you're an ACSC deeded partner, you've got the best chance of getting pushed our information as quickly as possible and as soon as we see it. In the week following the 19th of June, on the 19th of June, we issued a technical advisory, setting out the types of activity that we'd observed from that state actor. And we also published a series of indicators of compromise, which people could independently run on their own systems in order to determine whether or not the actor was on their system. 300,000 people downloaded that advisory in the days following that statement it's been by far the most downloaded publication, certainly in the recent history of the ACSC. Our partnership program on the 18th of June was around 350. Today we're at 1,017 and we'll probably make it close to 2,000 in the next few months. For those businesses that have read and utilised our advisory, and a number of those in the first few weeks came back to us and told us that they'd run the rules we'd given them and were able to self-identify the actor on their system, or to clarify with us whether or not the actor had been on their system and they'd been compromised or not. That's the sort of operational effective performance and KPI which I seek to perpetuate on an ongoing basis. That is, that we retain high levels of awareness, that we back that up with practical information that people are able to utilise themselves, because that's how we get speed, and that's how we get scale, and that's how we increase capability, and ultimately that's how you build national resilience, and that's how you get defence as the best offence. So I'm not attempting to avoid the question. I'm just trying to paint it in a mere operator's light in terms of what we've seen as the most effective way of dealing with that sort of behaviour.
Great. I have a curly question for you next from Stilgarian, who has who writes, the strategy doesn't set any timelines or deadlines for achieving any of the goals. Do we have any specifics yet on what will happen when?
Yes, we do, and we're already, a number of the things that we flagged in the cybersecurity strategy, you've already seen the manifestation of, whether that be the public discussion paper on the protection of critical infrastructure and systems of national significance, whether that be the Internet of Things voluntary code of practice, whether that be the critical technology supply chain principles that we put out today as a discussion paper. We are very conscious, as we've constantly been saying, that this is a partnership between government, between industry and the consumers. And the reason why we didn't say X will happen by Y is because we're only one of the three participants in this journey. And we needed to ensure that the other two participants both had an opportunity to give us good advice about the best way to deliver the effects that the cybersecurity strategy talks about, as well as help us co-design the process and the practical ways in which we will go forward. But the money that was identified in the cybersecurity strategy has already started to flow, and will continue to do so over both the forwards and the decade. The thing about strategies as opposed to plans is they tell you the goals that you're trying to achieve and the way in which you might go about those goals, but it's not an implementation plan. It doesn't say, here's the timeline for X happening and Y happening, because we're very conscious that, as I said, it's a partnership, a three-way partnership. But if we set a particular goal for a particular thing, before you know it, the technology's changed and you might have hit the goal really, really well, but it's not delivering the effect that you want, which is to build national resilience, to ensure that businesses, governments, and individuals are more cyber aware, are more capable of recognising the vulnerabilities and challenges they face in the online environment, and working constantly, because we will never achieve success, working constantly to ensure that they are delivering their own level of protection and safety in the online environment.
I just might add to that. I mean, certainly there are the normal checks and balances which are associated with funding, which we will obviously be part of. But the other part, Marc, is the Industry Advisory Council. So you might recall that Andy Penn chaired the Industry Advisory Panel, which informed a whole bunch of the recommendations and actually was an incredible useful insight to making sure that the strategy was able to work in that real partnership way, because in fact a large number of the recommendations and the strategy are informed by the views of those industry experts. And Andy Penn, it's been announced, sorry, Mark, I'm talking about your patch now, but, you know, you talk about mine all the time. That was a joke. Has been announced as the chair of the Industry Advisory Council, which has some a range of different members, and we've met already. And I can assure you, if the normal democratic processes don't keep us honest, industry will. They are truly. It's actually a great pleasure to be part of, because quite often when you operate as government from Canberra, particularly in COVID when you can't get out, conscious that you need a proper partnership with industry and trying to understand what the view of industry might be on a particular proposal, having that concentrated industry advisory council is brilliant for frank and fearless advice about how you're travelling.
Yeah.
It's feeling very Andy Penn here at the moment, actually, with my dogs barking in the background. Chan Chia we may have room for one quick response to this one. Disinformation is a real and present hybrid human and cyber-induced risk, especially among our culturally and linguistically diverse communities in Australia. Will this format of cybersecurity risk be considered a priority in the National Cybersecurity Strategy Plan, and any insights on how?
It is certainly a part of our thinking about cybersecurity. It is one of the things, as Abby said a little bit earlier, we want people to be thinking about when they use an application, what information you are allowing that application to deliver to the app developer or whomever about you. And it is certainly one of those things that we think very carefully about as part of cybersecurity. But it's not just a cybersecurity challenge. Disinformation is a much broader challenge than cybersecurity, and certainly there is a lot of work going on in government around disinformation and misinformation. There's a huge amount of COVID misinformation and disinformation that is currently out there in the public domain. We've seen, even this morning, the director of the FBI coming out and talking about disinformation as it is currently affecting the US elections. And so there are a number of different mechanisms that exist in government that deal with disinformation and misinformation, including in called communities in Australia. Certainly, it's one of the responsibilities of Home Affairs is social cohesion, to be working very closely with called communities to ensure that they both feel a part of the Australian society, can appropriately have their voice heard, and that they can get the messages that government is trying to deliver to the Australian community writ large in their own voice, in their own language, in their own experience and expectations. So it is something we're working very, very hard on.
Abby, did you want to jump in at all there?
No, I think that's right.
Great. Well, we are coming to the top of the hour, and I just wanted to take a moment to thank you both very much for taking the hour and all the time that it takes to prepare for these events to participate today. It's been a really rich discussion. You've seen the huge volume of questions that have come in from the hundreds of people that have been listening today. So there's obviously a lot of interest in the work that you're doing. I think it's extraordinary that you managed to get this up in the middle of a global pandemic when the country was in crisis mode. And it's been great to hear from you directly about what the plans are for the future and how you're going to implement this strategy. So thank you, Abby and Marc, very, very much for your time. And thank all of our participants for engaging so actively in the discussion. And we look forward to following up with you in the years and years ahead as we see how the strategy gets implemented and how it rolls out. So thank you all very much, and good afternoon.
Thank you.